Welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce Governing the Depth, the Politics of the Ocean, with Lakshmi Puri, Shyam Saran, Shombi in conversation with Navdeep Suri and introduced by Anthony Miranda. There are numerous institutions looking into the use or protection of the sea worldwide. These include multinational organizations like the United Nations, and of course, national governments themselves. This fragmentation of responsibilities makes it harder to ensure that the use of the sea is entirely sustainable. A panel of geopolitical experts overview the existing deep sea governance arrangements, addressing the logistical challenges inherent in monitoring resource exploitation and the need to protect one of Earth's last true frontiers. I'm delighted to introduce our first guest, Lakshmi Puri, who is a former IFS officer and ambassador. She is a distinguished fellow of the Indian Association of International Studies and recipient of the prestigious Eleanor Roosevelt Prize for Human Rights. Puri is also a published author of several reports and research papers. Next, we have Shyam Saran, a Padma Bhushan awardee, who is a former Secretary of India and has served Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. He is currently the president of the Indian International Center and an honorary senior fellow with the Center for Policy Research. He has recently published his second book, How China Sees India and the World. Next is Shombi, the UN Resident Coordinator for India, who has devoted over 25 years to promoting sustainable development. He has previously served as UN Resident Coordinator in Armenia, with the UNDP in Armenia, Georgia, Lebanon, Europe and the CIS, the Western Balkans, New York, and the Russian Federation, and with CARE in Zimbabwe. After that is Navdeep Suri, who is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. A former diplomat, Suri has served as India's ambassador to UAE and Egypt and as High Commissioner to Australia. His translations of the first two novels on the partition of India in 1947 have recently been published as Hymns in Blood. Introducing them is Anthony Miranda, who is the Cultural and Educational Affairs Counselor for the Public Diplomacy Section and leads the US mission to India's public engagements and programming. He has served in Munich, Kabul, Sofia, and Madrid, and he has served the US mission to the United Nations in New York City and in Washington in the Executive Secretary, Advancing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's overseas travel. We're looking forward to an excellent session. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here at the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival. I had the opportunity to be here for the first time last year, and I was so impressed by the quality and the depth and the range of all of the discussions. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here today. And I'm delighted that the U.S. Embassy continues to be a sponsor of the Jaipur Literature Festival and is a sponsor of this important conversation on the politics of the blue economy. Today's session brings together some great minds to analyze and discuss the ways that governments, international organizations, and other stakeholders are working together to ensure a sustainable and equitable blue economy. We look forward to hearing the panelists' discussion and overview of existing deep-sea governance and their insights on both the logistical challenges of monitoring and managing this shared resource, as well as effective governance strategies. You know, President Biden is really highlighting the importance of conserving and restoring the health and productivity of the ocean, and has even launched efforts to create America's first ever Ocean Climate Action Plan. And I want to quote something that he said: "The world's ocean basins are critical to the success of our nation and indeed to life on Earth. The ocean powers our nation, our economy, provides food for billions of people, supplies 50% of the world's oxygen, offers recreational opportunities for us to enjoy, and regulates weather patterns and our global climate system. So the Biden-Harris administration has really made effective management of the blue economy a priority and has announced several steps to combat the climate crisis and preserve our ocean in collaboration, of course, with global partners. So these actions include things like accelerating efforts across the US government and internationally to combat illegal, unreported, or unregulated fishing and the associated labor abuses with that trade, support for aquatic contributions to food security, the announcement of a bipartisan infrastructure law that funds ocean and coastal resilience, habitat restoration, and the prevention of marine debris, leadership on the development of an action plan to conserve, restore, and sustainably manage global coral reef systems, and finally, the release of a National Ocean Policy Committee action plan. Now, while these initiatives, of course, are going to benefit not only Americans, but people around the world, they also require global cooperation and coordinated efforts. And the U.S. is really seeking to develop and manage marine resources effectively and efficiently with other countries and the international community. And certainly one step in this direction is our active participation in the G20 Intergovernmental Forum for International Economic Cooperation and supporting, of course, India's presidency of the G20. And we're really delighted to see that the blue economy is also a priority for India this year. So without further ado, let me turn it over to the ambassador for kicking off this panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for so succinctly summing up my opening remarks on the blue economy. I owe you a debt. Let me try and put it differently then, that the UN estimated that the value of the blue economy is somewhere between $3 to $6 trillion. If the oceans were a country, they would be the 7th largest economy in the world. And that's why they're getting so much attention these days. The potential is known. Many of the world's megacities, 13 out of the 20, sit on the oceans. The seas carry 90% of global trade. They carry 95% of global data. They feed a lot of people. And yet we are fairly careless in how we're dealing with them. I want to start with Ambassador Lakshmi Puri. How do you see the recognition of the blue economy in our discourse today growing in the last few years? I don't think many people used this term, say, 10 years back, and now everybody's talking about it, including the G20. And what are the challenges that are coming up?
Well, let me first begin by saying what is at stake. You've already set out some of the critical aspects, and I think our opening speaker from the US mission too. But I just want to emphasize that the oceans represent the next frontier, but also an essential frontier for humankind's survival in terms of food, water, minerals, metals, all the resources, the rich resources, rare earths, which are, by the way, vital for even renewable energy equipment that we are using. So even renewable energy would not be possible without some of the resources that we need to tap because we are running out of them in the land, our population increase. So as the terrestrial capacity wanes, you need the ocean's resources. But equally, as you pointed out, it is ecological resource. It is the largest ecosystem in the world, in the planet. And it has, as you said, 96% of the world's water resources. It is a depolluter, it is all the other. So what we need to do is very much sustainably harvest it for humanity. But we need to harvest it. So that kind of dialectic we have to solve, and that is what the blue economy is about. So, so it's a green-blue economy, if I may put it that way. And yes, it became, I think, current I was in with the Small Island Developing States Conference in 2012, and this whole discourse started. And then in 2015, the SDG 14 was adopted, which is the Sustainable Development Goal, which has 10 targets and 10 indicators, and it calls for conservation and protection of ocean resources for sustainable development. So, and there is, of course, the economic harvesting and sustainable use of those resources, which is very critical. Now, in international discourse, since then, there has been great progression, including in the context of regional cooperation. UN has always had, and I'm sure you're going to, Shombi, you're going to highlight that, so I will not go there. But since we are looking at, for example, G20, there has been a series of discourses on this, policies on this, and even Bali adopted some decisions with regard to cooperation in sustainable development of the ocean. So this is something that is being, now, so what we need, of course, is cooperation, not contestation and conflict. And I hope other speakers are going to highlight how that is happening. No ocean grabbing, because the oceans, the concept has moved from res nullis to res communis. It's a common heritage of mankind. So even the 30%, which is in the economic zones of countries, is of course yours, but even there you must sustainably harvest it. And the 60%, which is areas beyond national jurisdiction, even there it must be sustainably harvested and shared, because those countries who have ownership of some resources do not have the capacity to harvest them. So there is this whole concept of common heritage, which is from the UN clause, the law of the sea. That spirit has to be there, and also it has to be implemented on the ground.
Thank you. Ambassador, and you were the Prime Minister's special envoy on the environment, and I've seen you write passionately about some of the unsustainable development practices on the land. What is happening in the oceans that gets you worried?
Well, I have written about the oceans as well, but maybe not as much as on the earth. Let me take up what Lakshmi mentioned about the common heritage of mankind, because this is a concept which in 1967 actually was pioneered by somebody called Avid Pardo, a diplomat at the UN. And since then, that concept has taken hold. And he actually said that, the dark oceans were really the womb of life. And, it is from the oceans that all life emerged. And also he pointed out that we still bear in our own bodies the mark of that origin, because our blood is salty. Our tears, bitter tears, are also salty. So this is really, when we are talking about the oceans, we are talking about how deeply, deeply connected we are with the oceans. I think that's something that we should remember. What is the current situation with regard to the oceans? This heritage that we have. I think most people do not realize that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by oceans. 50% of the oxygen that you breathe comes from the oceans. 90% of the trade that is carried out throughout the world, our whole economy, is ocean-borne trade. That is how important it is. So what is happening to the oceans now? What is happening to the oceans now that it is under tremendous, tremendous amount of stress. Just one aspect because we have very little time, plastics in the ocean. Do you know that in the Pacific, there is actually a whole island of plastics floating in the oceans. It is the size of France. Can you imagine? The kind of, when plastics are thrown in the ocean, and 10 million tons of plastics are thrown into the oceans every year. And a lot of this is microplastics, which then get into the food chain because fish ingest it, mussels ingest it. It is said that, within a week, as much plastic is ingested by you, like perhaps munching on a plastic credit card every week. That is how much you ingest plastics. So this is one of the biggest problems that we have with the oceans. What do we do about this plastic? Overfishing. Virtually across the world, fish stocks are under tremendous amount of stress. Now, mention was made of the exclusive economic zones, but something like 60% or more of the oceans is not under any national jurisdiction. It is the high seas. And these are the commons. Who is looking after these commons? So the kind of over-exploitation which is going on in those commons is something that we perhaps are not even aware of. Only 10% of this is protected today. There is a target of making it 30% protected. But with this 10% protection, should it be any surprise that in fact we are ravaging the oceans? So yes, we have talked about what's happening on land, but there is something very sinister happening in the oceans as well. And the land and the oceans, finally I would like to make the point, are connected. Because it is the rivers which carry water into the oceans, and if those are laden with plastics, they are laden with all kinds of hazardous material. Should it be a surprise to you that there are today something like 130 dead zones in our oceans? Dead zone means no marine life, no oxygen in that water. If you do not watch out, then perhaps a very large part of the ocean space might become dead zone. That is how serious the problem is. Thank you.
Yeah, and on the land, at least, people have a vote and they can do something. The fish, unfortunately, don't yet have a vote to protest against what we are doing to them. Ambassador Shah, it's been 40 years since the UN Convention on the Law of Sea was finalized in 1982. What does the convention do? Does it provide any remedial measures to address the situation? What are the other treaties that have emerged in the international framework? Like Ambassador Saran said, who manages the commons?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And first, let me just say namaste. Mujhe aap sab se milkar bahut acha laga. Great to see so many, also so many young people here. I'm always, happy to say that we're talking about partnerships across the generations. So it's the young people. India has the world's largest youth generation, greatest youth generation, but also the "Wo jo dil se young hai" is my favorite phrase. So don't forget those of us who have been around for a little while, even since before the UNCLAS. So basically, I think what we're looking at here, it's a kind of good news, bad news type of story. And, very soon after the United Nations was formed, the world came together and realized, okay, when we're speaking about oceans, this is the greatest, maybe together with the air, the greatest sort of challenge of the commons. And where you have really intensive, moral hazards, negative externalities, all of these things. We need a way to manage, a way to govern this. And actually, in the beginning, the International Maritime Organization was founded, which is now, I think, over about 50 years old. And, but that really focused more on the high seas shipping. And, looking at pollution, biodiversity, hazards, things like that from shipping, content of fuel oils and that sort of a thing. Then the UN Convention on the Law of Seas was agreed. And that really focused on sort of the area off the sovereign coasts of coastal countries, and looking at how to organize and manage the economic, the blue economy, basically within a certain sort of zone, 200 nautical miles, so to speak. And that was implemented largely through the concept of these exclusive economic zones, which, Shyam, you were speaking about. And I think, really that, from one perspective, we can say, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, this was the ocean's constitution. And it's considered one of the most critical pieces of multilateral legislation, in the last, certainly since the United Nations. Now, the problem is that clearly time has moved on, technology has moved on. We recognize that two-thirds, the high seas, two-thirds of the oceans are not explicitly covered by the UNCLOS, as it's called, and these economic zones and such. Also, technology has advanced. I mean, the industrial, intensive, technologically driven fishing, the overfishing problem, is something that you couldn't even dream of in the 1950s and such. So, in fact, I don't know if anyone here has seen Avatar, but just to use a kind of a common pop culture reference, the Tolkien, this massive, okay, that's science fiction, but it's not science fiction. Actually, if you just go and Google and look at industrial fishing today, it's absolutely frightening what's happening. So, and then also we did create, the UN under these structures created a sort of a tribunal, basically to address disputes between countries. I think we've seen a fairly recent kind of arbitration results between Philippines and China, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's a whole lot in terms of this ocean governance that is there to build on, that is working to some degree, but we have to update this architecture. Absolutely, this is critically important, and I think that's where this is kind of the bad news bit. I think we'll get to a bit of the good news. I think a lot is happening there, and India has a very important role as well to play in that space too. So maybe I'll come back to that in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Sharps left us with India. So, Ambassador Puri, the Prime Minister's put a fair bit of emphasis on the Sagar initiative, the security and growth for all in the region. The blue economy is again something that's getting a lot of emphasis. Please tell our audience how does India see this emerging sector, and how do we not become a part of the problem that the world is facing?
Thank you. Now, India, with a coastline of 75,000 kilometers, 7,500 miles, and EZ of I think 2.3 million kilometers, has a very big stake in the ocean economy. And Prime Minister made this very determined effort to really become a leader, for India to become a leader in this ocean economy by announcing in Mauritius in 2015 that the blue chakra in India's flag is really, to him, a symbol of the stake that India has in the blue economy. So this and the Sagar initiative was also launched at that time. And under that, a number of regional initiatives have flourished and have actually been taken forward, including under the Act East policy with ASEAN, with BIMSTEC, and with the Indian Ocean Rim Initiative, where Ambassador Shyam Saran was High Commissioner in Mauritius, and I used to be negotiating the emergence of this grouping. And so this, under all of these now, there are cooperative, first of all, there are working groups, there are mechanisms for identifying areas of cooperation, covering the blue economy. And blue economy kind of portfolio is emerging, and it is becoming the center of these regional groupings. And then, of course, there is the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. So in all of these areas, India is emphasizing cooperation in the blue economy. And itself, at the national level, a major step is being taken, and I'm told any time now, they are going to adopt the blue economy policy for India, which brings together all the different sectors, because it's a very multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral area, all the different sectors from food and agriculture, fisheries, to industry, trade, shipping, transport, the whole range of areas, and of course, environment, very importantly so. And then all the stakeholders, and also have a coordinating mechanism, because whether at the global level, at the regional level, or at the national level, there is a challenge of coordination. Who to be coordinated? Who is to coordinate? What are the issues that we should relate to each other? So that is now blue economy policy, which has been in the anvil, now is going to be promulgated very soon. So that's the other aspect. And very importantly, I think I think India has traditionally been a very strong supporter of global governance, UNCLOS, all the other international governance bodies. We have been partners in. India was one of the pioneer investors, has major sites allocated to it for exploitation, for exploration right now, and it has been extended further, and for deep seabed mining, because there are two elements. One is you referred to fishing, which is in the water column, and overfishing and the stock, the elements that we have WTO subsidies agreement, which was historically reached recently, but also you have the fish stocks review conference, agreement review conference. So in all of that is the water column resources, but the deep sea mining, bed mining, is a key element of that. And there, India has been one of the 8 pioneer investors, and there is now a maritime biodiversity treaty being negotiated, where India has joined the High Ambition Coalition, along with France and some other 24 countries. So India is very much a part of the global architecture and rule-making and strengthening of the norms for maritime governance, but for sustainable development of ocean resources.
Mr. Saran, partly the topic we had was the politics of the ocean. Now, in a sense, the politics perhaps has been jiski lathi uski bhans. He who has the stick carries off the buffalo. We saw that in the case of countries from Europe initially that developed the deep sea fishing trawlers. Then China came in. And then China said, hey, this is not enough. Let me also make some islands and dredge up the oceans to make those islands in the South China Sea. And the impunity with which individual countries can continue to flout any norms that are in place really shows that the politics needs to do a lot of catching up with the reality on the ground. How do you, as somebody who's worked on these issues, see this developing?
So I think, as it has been pointed out by Ambassador Sharp and also by Lakshmi, it's not as if the ocean is a totally ungoverned space. So there are several instruments which are in fact in place, the law of the sea being the most important one, to try and introduce some semblance of governance as far as the oceans are concerned. We are also at the moment negotiating an international instrument for governance of those ungoverned spaces, which is the high seas. So the high seas treaty is under negotiation at this point of time. So you are right. It's not so much that the rule-based order is totally missing as far as the oceans are concerned, but there is an implementation gap. And that implementation gap derives almost entirely from this kind of, very unequal power structure that we have in the world. Now, here, I think what is perhaps very important is that, there must be some way found for implementing decisions of governing bodies, international bodies. So you have, under the law of the sea, you have the Permanent International Tribunal, and that did pronounce on some of the issues that you raised. What about offshore islands or islands which do not really count as islands, because unless they are also visible at high tide, they cannot count as islands. And therefore, rights which come from the ownership of islands does not apply to those. So that is why, the Chinese are dredging a lot of sand and creating artificial islands. Although, to be fair, the International Tribunal has also said this kind of artificial island building cannot count as islands. Then, with respect to the what is the status of the exclusive economic zone or continental shelf, which countries are entitled to. All those rights, by the way, derive from land frontiers. So it is the extension of land that actually determines your exclusive economic zone, 200 miles from your coast, and the continental shelf, which is determined by investigation as to what it is. Now China has come up with a concept which has no place in the law of the sea, which is to say historic waters. What are historic waters? Basically saying that the whole of the South China Sea are historic waters, because this is where traditionally China has been present and China has been fishing, therefore it belongs to us. So I think these are the kind of things which obviously have to be resisted. And they are important to be resisted for the simple reason, as I mentioned to you, 90% of world's trade traverses the oceans. Every country has an interest in the safety and security of these sea lanes. Now, you can have, because you are a powerful country, you can make unilateral kind of moves in order to protect your sea lanes. Unilateral. Now, if you do it unilaterally, should it come as a surprise to you that others will therefore also raise their military expenditures, their naval assets in order to protect themselves? And that is precisely what is happening. If you look at most of Southeast Asia today, that is precisely, this is the region where the highest military expenditures are taking place today. Now, I think it is in this context that India has repeatedly made what I think is perhaps, the most logical kind of a proposal. We, instead of having a regime where you have unilateral assurance of security, or you pursue unilateral assurance of security, why do not we create a maritime architecture where there is mutual assurance of security? Because all of us, as I said, are dependent upon the oceans. So if we have multilateral assurance of security, you would be creating a maritime architecture which is open, which is transparent, which is inclusive, and which is balanced. It sounds like a mantra, but it's, I think, a very good mantra. So this is the kind of, initiative that you need in order to bring about this semblance of order that we are talking about. Now, by the way, India is perhaps one of the few countries which has actually implemented decisions of under the law of the sea, with regard to, for example, the island territory which was under dispute with Bangladesh. So I think India has a good record, has credibility, and I think it would be very worthwhile if India could actually take an initiative with respect to creating this kind of a maritime security architecture.
Absolutely. But Ambassador Shah, the point that Ambassador Saran makes, that you have a certain global architecture in place, you have the law of the sea, then you have a country violating the law, then you have an international tribunal which looks at it very carefully and says, yes, China was at fault on a complaint made by Philippines on the South China Sea. And then nothing happens. So how does the UN system try and do something, plus the other issues that have come up? You're supposed to be, everybody looks at the United Nations to be a part of the solution, right? So do you see any possibility of the United Nations doing something concrete on this, and not link it with perhaps the United Nations Security Council reform from where some of the power flows?
Thank you for that very easy question to respond to. No, I think, look, I would just say, I mean, certainly, as is the case with many of the United Nations, sort of architecture and things like this, ultimately, the question always comes to, what kind of teeth are there? And it's carrot and stick and this kind of a thing. And ultimately, the UN is limited to the agreements of the member states, sort of thing. I heard someone before, I think it was Shashi Tora, actually, who was talking about UN as both a stage and an actor. It's a stage for member states to act, and only once they come to an agreement, then the UN itself, I mean, the institution can kind of, come to life and act. But I think, if we look at a more macro sort of picture, this is where I want to bring a little bit of optimism. I mean, it's very late optimism, and we don't have, the Secretary General has said we're in an oceans, emergency as well. But I think if we look at just kind of recent years, and we look at the trajectory, the pace of things now, that there is reason to be sort of optimistic about kind of the general momentum and movement towards securing the sustainable future for the seas. I mean, the recognition, as has already been mentioned by ambassadors, the seas are the source of, if properly managed, could increase our food security by 600%, could increase our access for renewable energy by 40 times, these sorts of things. So now we're understanding it not as a sort of, here's the ocean over here, here's the land over here, but this is all one important complex. 2015, the SDGs. For the first time there, you've got the SDG 14, but it's these crystallizing concepts of blue economy and blue finance. 2018, then basically you've got, let's say, you've mentioned already the High Seas Treaty. So the whole idea is that UNCLOS, we're striving since 2018, negotiating for essentially an UNCLOS 2.0, to bring in the entire high seas into that same type of architecture. 2021, COP26, for the first time, COP26 integrated the ocean's role in addressing climate change as part of the UNFCCC. 2022, last year, COP15, biodiversity COP there, this agreement on 30 by 30 by 2030, and including 30% of biodiversity in the seas as part of that. We also had last year the Plastics Treaty at the UN Environmental Assembly, which this island the size of France, it's said that by 2050 there might be more plastic in the ocean than fish. These sorts of horrific images. So a plastic treaty, very, very important. Also, the Oceans Conference that we had just last year, where the Secretary General outlined, and I would just sort of mention his key points there. We need to invest in oceans. Only 1% of climate financing so far is going to the oceans. This is critical. The private sector needs to play a huge role. Make oceans a model for managing the global commons. Coastal communities, the important role that coastal communities are playing. This links also to the loss and damages fund of COP27. India's long been an advocate for Global South, for countries who are paying the price for what has been the economic benefit of others. And then finally, more science and innovation. It's often said that we know more about the surface of the moon and even Mars now than we do of the sea. So we have to learn more and apply this technology and scientific advances that we have to that. And then just looking ahead, this is an incredible time. We've got India's G20 presidency, and India has placed as a priority in the G20 presidency new principles for sustainable and resilient blue economy. The LIFE initiative of India, the Prime Minister, is addressing directly sustainable consumption and production, impacting on oceans in particular. And there's a proposed new G20 dialogue on the oceans dialogue, in which we see India is pushing the G20 to identify best practices and how to bring all of these things together. And then, and we have the SDG Summit next year. And India's G20 presidency, I'm calling it an SDG 20, is perfectly segueing into the global SDG Summit. And then finally, the young people of India. I know I'm over time here, but from Archana Sarang, who's a young activist from Orissa and a member of the Secretary General's Youth Advisory Panel on Climate Change, to Afro Shah, who started the world's largest beach cleanup in Mumbai, and I've had the opportunity to join there. There's so much happening in this country at the geopolitical level and at the level of youth and communities. So from my perspective here, I do feel optimistic.
So there's some room for optimism, as Ambassador Sharp has outlined, but let me see if we have time to take one or two questions from the floor. Okay, gentleman over there.
Hello, I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland. We had COP26. My organization, we worked very much with the New York Times. I'd like to say about the New York Times has the greatest number of journalists focused on climate warming and ecological crises of any major newspaper. What the panel has said, I agree with. I'm sure many people here agree.
Do you have a question?
Yes. The question is, why is there is so little good news about anything which isn't just at the treaty level, but actually gets to the level of the industrial fishing fleets, making them pay, making the sea transport pay for its pollution in the ports as well as out at sea.
Okay.
There is no policing.
Ambassador, you want to take that? Why isn't there enough policing on the illegal fishing of trawlers and so on?
Because there is big money involved. The sad fact is that much of what you are seeing is because of greed. And I think, unfortunately, the attitude of most governments is also parochial. I will try and prevent illegal fishing by some other country, but don't touch my illegal fishing. So if you have that kind of as I said, sentiment amongst governments themselves, then I'm not surprised that this happened, which is the reason why it is so necessary to have empowered international institutions. Empowered is very important. That is, it should not be left to this or that country to, in fact, impose penalties wherever required, but by the international organization itself, which is not subject to those kind of pressures or less subject to those kind of pressures. This is across the board, you see this. Even where, this is why I said right in the beginning, there is an implementation gap. An implementation gap is linked to this.
I think Ambassador Puri has a
I
supplement.
just want to add to that, that there is no international policing mechanism. As, I mean, to take your point further, and there are, as you also said, no teeth, the international institutions. Even for deep sea mining, the International Seabed Authority doesn't have the resources to actually do the policing and to check what's happening. And they have to rely sometimes on the private sector resources. So if you're policing the private sector or countries who are allowing this to happen, then you have to have an international authority with the policing functions, holding countries accountable, enforcing the rules.
So kind of a UN peacekeeping force for the oceans.
Absolutely.
Gentleman from there.
Mr. Chairman, could I have your permission to ask a question to Ambassador Shah? Sir, considering the dangerous expansion... Can you speak up? Considering the dangerous expansion of China in the region of South China Sea, could you please highlight us the importance of security arrangement for the South Pacific Ocean and the coming of the concept of the Quad partnership between the US, Japan, and Australia and India?
Okay, what I'm going to do is, that one is from Ambassador Shah. The lady over there had a, yes, ma'am, you, yes?
Sir, I am a student of MTech, Water Resources Engineering, and I wanted to know about the future of ocean energy in India. As earlier I was studying about the United Kingdom, before the Brexit, they were converting the high tides into the ocean energy by constructing a series of turbines at their seashores. But due to some political interruptions, it wasn't working. So right now, what was our future in ocean energy?
Okay, great question. I have to take one from this side, otherwise I'll be accused of right-wing tendencies. So,
hello, sir. My question is, as ma'am has rightly mentioned about the common heritage of mankind regarding the oceans. So it's a common question that since climate change has been a part of, like, it has been evolving very much and the temperatures are on the rise and we are trying to make policies to bring it down. Since US is the largest emitter and India is being at third number also. So are we heading towards the same kind of over-exploitation of the resources what we have done to the land masses by, in the name of blue economy, what we are going to do the same to these, oceans?
okay, 3 questions, 3 panelists. Ambassador Shah, you go first.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, as much as I would wish to give you a satisfying and insightful answer, the question is probably at a depth, an ocean depth beyond my competency. But just simply to say that, obviously the United Nations is supporting multilateral arrangements, security arrangements, economic and social and such, and always pursuing and promoting means to avoid sort of unilateral action, as Ambassador Shyam was speaking about before. And I did just want to add that that there are, again, it's about the teeth and this sort of thing, but there are more movements towards this more awareness and identifying and information tracking, naming, shaming, and actions for illegal fishing and for these types of behaviors. The Food and Agricultural Organization, some Port State Measurements Agreement, for example, is picking up speeds. Something like almost 100 countries now have signed on to that one, and that's specifically
Yeah.
about.
I think we're running
targeting-
out of time, so I
Okay.
need to give 30 seconds each to Ambassador Saran and Ambassador Puri.
No, I'll just answer the question about the energy from tidal waves. There are two technologies which have been under examination. One is, of course, the turbines being run by ocean waves, and the other is taking advantage of the difference in temperature at the surface level and at the lower level in the ocean space. Both of these technologically are possible, but they are not viable yet. That is, they are not a cost-effective alternative at this point of time. So, though the research is continuing, and in fact, in our own Lakshmi Islands, we are using some of this technology to produce local energy, but it has not reached a point where actually it can be a viable source of energy.
I just want to answer the last question, which is a very vital one, which is that we have to learn from the mistakes that we have made in harvesting the resources on land and not do the same for the ocean. And the blue economy concept is not just about exploiting the resources, the very much needed resources of the ocean, but it's also about sustainable development of those resources, sustainable harvesting of those resources, conservation of those resources, protection of those resources. So we have to learn from our mistakes, and the blue economy is about doing an alternative sustainable development model.
Thank you very much. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
And with that, we would like to thank Lakshmi Puri, Shyam Saran, Shombi, Anthony Miranda, and Navdeep Suri for this riveting discussion. We thank the US Embassy in India for their support. And some additional announcements in terms of social media. Please subscribe to the Jaipur Literature Festival YouTube channel to access all the sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2023 and tag @JaipurLitFest. And for the evening, please do book tickets for the Jaipur.